All right, well, good morning. By my clock, it's 9 o'clock, so I guess we should go ahead and dive in. I think our moderator is missing, so I'll just start things off. I'm David Abernathy. I'm a professor in global studies and teach GIS at Warren Wilson College, which is a small liberal arts college just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, about 750 students. And I'm going to be talking a bit about open source GIS, open educational resources, that's OER, and also open data in GIS education. 2 years ago, I presented at this conference, and I had just started transitioning our classes from mostly proprietary software to mostly open source software. And I talked a lot about the how, because I was kind of iterating different approaches. OSGeo Live, could I have a full Linux desktop stack, all open source, or do we run it on Windows? And so I was asking questions about sort of best practices for that. I'm going to talk today a bit more about sort of the why. I think we've pretty much settled in on the how, at least for now, at Warren Wilson. But I think the why is still particularly important, especially as we begin to broaden our ideas of open beyond just software and into the educational resources and open data. So today what I'd like to try to run through quickly is, again, why did we decide to transition to mostly open source software? And I say here with a nod back to proprietary, we did end up having to run our software on Windows machines because of IT's demands to keep our labs pretty consistent. And we do actually have some ArcGIS licenses still, but we're mostly an open source shop. And then secondly, what I've been doing since the last conference is focusing on how can we expand these ideas to, again, not just the software, but the materials, the textbooks, the labs, the tutorials that students want to have access to. So that's what I'm going to try to get through quickly here this morning. So when sort of making my case for why transitioning, I came up with what I thought was a nice fancy 7-letter acronym for that effort, and it's this. And I put the exclamation mark because that's kind of what my IT folks said when I said, hey, can we run a Linux lab and have all this open source? And they really didn't want to sort of have differential labs on campus. But the E's sort of do kind of run through why I think it's important to transition to open source. So I'll go through these, and I guess the bookends here, the first and last E's are ones that might be the ones that mostly come up in conversation and might be somewhat controversial. So I'd like to get some thoughts from this group towards the end. The one that typically comes up first is expense. And that was the case for us. The last decade has been pretty lean times in higher education for some of the smaller colleges like ours. So every expenditure gets scrutinized, and every year the annual maintenance fee would come up, and my accounting office would sort of ask me to justify that. And increasingly, I couldn't. At the time, we were paying for an Esri lab kit, we were paying for spatial analyst licenses, we were paying annual maintenance fee, and the alternative was that. And again, we're a small school. It wasn't like we had a campus-wide enterprise license or anything like that, but it was still enough of an expense that we had to sort of think about it. That has changed. We have some licenses that we pay far less for now, so we do have access to Esri products, but we decided to make the leap and go to free. But the free, as many of you know, Richard Stallman likes to talk about free as in liberty, not just free as in beer. And that's where I kind of get excited about open source software, particularly at a place like Warren Wilson College. Our second E here is ethos. I like to consider our students, if you know anything about our students, they have to work 15 to 20 hours a week on campus. So they're cleaning the bathrooms, they're serving food, they're cutting down trees in the forest, they're running the organic garden. I tend to classify them as a student body of makers. We have a blacksmith shop, right? We have a fine woodworking crew. We have a fiber arts crew. We have an organic garden. We have an herb crew. And what all these have in common, I think, is that students like to be a part of the process of making, not just end consumers of a prepackaged product. So I think that can be extended to open source software too. Let them sort of get into the process, look under the hood, build a plugin, and do things that they might not otherwise do. So related to that, not just maybe my particular institution, but I think education across the board needs to adopt these values of open source. I mean, it's what we teach as educators, is to have students be curious, to look under the hood, figure out how things work, not be told, disregard this black box, just trust it, right? And so, again, going back to Richard Stallman, he's obviously a staunch advocate for this, saying we need to be teaching free software just like we teach things like conservation, civic identity, voting, and things like that. So I tend to agree with that. Again, if you believe in the scientific method, you should probably be believing in open source software. Reproducible science requires that you be able to have access to open source. So I didn't include open science in my opening title, but that's part of this too, right? Is opening up not just the results, but the process. A piece of this, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but this has been really helpful for me as the only GIS person at a very small school, is have a community of educators that I can reach out to and learn from. So the Geo for All initiative has really, I think, got some momentum, and a lot of labs, a lot of professors, a lot of tutorials, a lot of data here that I can sort of participate and be a part of and ask questions and ask, how do you do this, right? So OSGeo, this Geo for All initiative has been really immensely valuable for me as an educator at a small school. Another E is ease of use. I think when I first started teaching GIS at Warren Wilson about 16 years ago, open source was not what it is today. There was a bit more of a learning curve, and most of my students are going to take one GIS class, maybe two at most, but typically they're getting some exposure. I can't spend a lot of time with compiling software and having them troubleshoot that. So I want it to be relatively straightforward so we can dive into GIS. And for me, it was sort of using QGIS and realizing that I could directly access GRASS command line tools, or increasingly other GIS tools are being sort of built into the same platform that students are extremely comfortable with, whether they've seen ArcGIS or not. That to me was when I realized that I think I can really teach this, right? That this seems to be as good, if not better, in terms of my needs for an educator as proprietary software. So we mainly use QGIS with GRASS. We do some R as well. And one that I maybe didn't expect when we started doing this was how it really expanded GIS outside of the laboratory. We have one GIS lab on campus, and increasingly GIS is required for certain environmental studies majors. It's also in global studies, and that same lab gets used for computer science and other courses. And so increasingly students were saying, hey, we can't get our work done. We can't get into the lab. So to have students suddenly downloading QGIS on their Macs or their Linux PCs or whatever, I saw students in the library working on projects. I saw them in the cafeteria working on projects, and they would ask questions. And they could do this in their dorm room at 2 a.m., which seems to be when they prefer to work on GIS. And so it really, I think, it's been great for me because I can assign more homework, or I can flip the classroom a little bit and say, hey, do this tonight and come with your results instead of starting from point A in class. So that to me has been a sort of a transformative change I didn't necessarily anticipate. Also, open source software is definitely very extensible, right? We have plugins in QGIS that students can load. I have them at least use a few of these, if not start to look into how to design their own. And when we move to R and R Studio, I have to check every semester to see how many packages are available for installation in R. Right now, I think it's well over 13,000. And I couldn't even fit ones with a geo prefix on one screenshot. Okay, there's a lot of tools out there, and they're new ones all the time. And so we're really sort of pushing R as our sort of spatial, our programming language of choice. Final E, and this is one, again, a little bit controversial, and I would be curious to hear your perspective at the end of this, is employment. I had a faculty member just the other day say, you really need to be teaching Esri. You need to be teaching ArcGIS because that's what they're going to see when they get their first job. And I push back on that a little bit and argue that, maybe it's just somebody copying and pasting a job description that's been traveling down the line for a few years. Is it really what they are requiring? And in fact, Scott Barnwell from the city of Asheville, I think he showed up today, kind of told me the opposite, that he actually looks for open source experience, asks questions in interviews about open source experience when they hire, because his perception is that if you have some experience with that, you tend to be more of a creative problem solver. I mean, that's a generalization, but that's, I feel like more and more employers should be thinking along these lines instead of expecting expertise in one particular set of tools. So that's my quick blaze through the acronym of E's. And then what I've been trying to do the last 2 years, as I said, we settled in on sort of our software suite in our lab. And we started looking at how can we help students extend their education with open educational resources. We tend to know that GIS textbook, well, textbooks in general, I won't pick on GIS textbook, but there's been a lot of discussion about how expensive they are. And that graph there is the cost of textbooks compared to the inflation rate, right? Textbooks have gotten very expensive. And this is, I think, a real issue. Students, you sometimes say, well, they're paying all this tuition, they can afford a few books. But if they're taking chemistry and biology and suddenly it's $400, it can be a real impact. So one thing we want to do is sort of help focus on reducing the expense. But that's really not the only thing that textbooks can be. I think that's an actual phrase from a student evaluation of a book that I used, it was too hand-holdy. It felt like a cookbook, right? There were recipes that I can follow. I can give you the nice dish or the map at the end of it, but that doesn't necessarily translate to me being able to creatively think about problems and apply these tools in other contexts. So I listened to that and heard that, and so I switched to a book that was just sort of GI science, right, focusing on the history and background. And then they said, oh, this is too theoretical. I need something that shows me how to get my work done. There are books that I think bridge those two things, but they're again, they go back to expensive because they wrap in a DVD of data and they are out of date that next year, so you have to buy the new edition. So that once again comes back to expense. And even the best textbooks are going to be uneven, right? Some chapters you think are really great, others not so much, or these chapters are going to go too far over my students' heads, but you feel like you have to assign them because they paid for the book, right? So there's all kinds of problems with expensive proprietary textbooks as well. So we can start using that same language of open source and apply it to OER. Here's UNESCO's definition, but you see some of the same words showing up again: open, accessible, no cost, adaptable, reproducible. Those same ideas of open source software we are starting to see more and more in OER. And North Carolina, we're fortunate that the NC Live folks have started an Open Education North Carolina project that includes workshops. It includes faculty adoption grants, and I actually got one of these to formally switch textbooks from proprietary to OER for my classes. And so just this semester, I'm teaching GIS with the Essentials of Geographic Information Systems from the Open Textbook Library. And it's not perfect. Like I said, no textbook is, but it tends to be more on the software agnostic side, so it's not giving them the hand-holdy. I have to develop that part on my own. But so far, again, the jury's still out. I have to formally assess this in May, but I'm finding that students are reading it. I can tell they read it because I have it on our learning management system, so I can sort of big brother and track if they're accessing chapters or not. And they seem to be getting the concepts in terms of quizzes and labs. It doesn't seem to have I've seen nothing negative so far. I'll know more in May when I formally assess it. So we've been using that for intro to GIS. Then on top of that, again, because, let me go back one, this book, again, has no labs, has no packaged data, no tutorial data, no shapefiles, no anything. So I have to develop that on my own. Some people see that maybe as daunting. I already have all my labs developed. Why would I start over? I've actually found it to be sort of liberating to sort of, it almost allows me to develop and tailor my labs each semester based on the student makeup that I have in the class. If I have a lot of sustainable agriculture majors, we can focus our labs more on that. So I've found it to be, as an educator, helpful. Again, some of the same language here: open, reproducible, shared, no cost, right? The idea is that we can get access to open data and use it for our purposes in the classroom and research. And I'm lucky in that I'm right outside of Asheville, and there's a couple folks in this room actually that were a part of this effort back in 2011, 12, 13. We had an open data day in Asheville conference, some civic hacking events, right? Trying to take data and do things for good instead of having it just be locked away in PDFs or somewhere. So the City of Asheville actually opened an open data portal, and I have my students use this all the time. It's very easy. Say, go get the bus stop point layer and load it up into QGIS, and they can do it, no problem. So we're living in an era of increasingly open data. Many of you know about NC One Map. We use this all the time as well. And I have to stop here and talk a bit about that seamless parcels. We've had that for a few years now, you can see, July 15, but I'm still amazed by that. When I first got to Warren Wilson, we were trying to piece together parcel level data for 40 counties in western North Carolina. It actually took a grant. It took a full-time summer intern calling and trying to track down and driving out to a county to get their DVD, or being told, no, not unless you pay me. It was, I think, a full 9-month project. And now you can do it in an hour. So the increasing era of sharing, I think, is really great. Data.gov, again, a lot of municipalities have open data portals, and I tend to use these resources for students to go get access to data. Somebody told me that in an intro to GIS class, you should never let students get their own data. You should give them everything cleaned up and ready to go, which I totally disagree with. So week 2, I make students go out and get data. That's as you all know, can be 90% of the struggle, is getting it cleaned up and into GIS. So we spend a lot of time, but again, easier and easier all the time with these resources. Going back to OSGeo, again, this Geo for All initiative, there's a lot of, it's not just textbooks, not just individual data layers, but tutorials, videos, walkthroughs, and there's new ones getting added to this all the time. And so, again, I can assign students to do some homework of watching a tutorial, even walking through it on their laptops outside the classroom, so that when they walk into the class, we're all ready to talk about the exercise instead of just me introducing it right there. So a lot of great resources out there, and new ones all the time. Of course, many of you know about the good FOSS4G, free and open source software for geospatial groups. There's a North America conference coming up in April in San Diego. They also just had the international conference in Tanzania. Very vibrant community of people passionate about promoting open source in higher education. One of the speakers at this conference literally just tweeted 20 minutes ago that he's giving a talk along these lines, sort of evangelizing open source in higher ed. So if you have the resources, a great group of folks to get to know. So then in terms of takeaways or next steps for me, so sort of a current snapshot of where things are, some things I've noticed that I think are beneficial is that we're starting to see some critical mass around R as a computing tool at Warren Wilson. If you take ecology or conservation biology, now every statistics course has gone to that. I think our lone holdout right now might be psychology. They're still holding on to SPSS. But we're getting students used to seeing it across their courses and not seeing it as a GIS tool or just a statistics tool. And I think that's a good thing. We also have just launched, as of last semester, a new minor in data science. We kind of saw, at least in my experience, we had students taking computer science courses, but they weren't the same students that were taking GIS courses. And we wanted some cross-pollination there. And I think this minor is one way we'll get students to do it, to realize this is all data science. And we have some, again, this is sort of anecdotal since we're so new into this, but we're seeing some student success, both in graduate programs and in careers. I have a student who got a master's in applied math working for a startup in Raleigh, a student in the geospatial analytics PhD at NC State, and students have worked for City of Asheville, some startups, or increasingly nonprofits. A lot of our environmental studies folks are really looking to do work at NGOs and have had some success with open source there. Most recently, we had a couple of students participate in NASA. This is a NASA-NOAA collaborative internship program, a 10-week intensive project where you work on a particular set of tools for a particular client, and a team of 4 people here. We're working on developing a snowmelt predictive, looking at snowmelt to predict wildfires in Alaska. 2 of the 4 were from Warren Wilson, and they pulled off this pretty impressive project. And I asked, one of our students was the team lead, and I asked her, did you feel any sort of, did you feel like you were missing out having not had Esri training prior to that? Because they did use ArcGIS in part for this project. And she said, no, not at all. The concepts were very transferable. Her issue was really having to beef up her Python because there was a lot of sort of batch processing and iteration that had to go on. But she didn't feel like she was not well prepared to dive into this type of work. And I guess I'll just wrap up with sort of where I hope we can kind of go next. This is a drone photo of our new academic building and then looking over at our farm and our forest up to Jones Mountain up there. And I'm trying to take this idea of open and move it into the Internet of Things world a bit. We got a grant to get a weather station on campus, but in addition, that was not open source, but in addition to that, we had a student up in the upper right there start working with Arduinos and radios and basically created a mobile weather station that would record soil moisture and soil temperature that our farm manager was very excited about because he wanted to use it in different farm fields at different times so that he could plan planting, save money, hopefully, for the college by anticipating when the right time to plant would be and that kind of thing. So we've developed, it's still kind of prototype, but we've developed a sensor to do that. We also have another student taking a good old Arduino, just lighting up an LED, but he wants to take those and install them in some of the bat boxes that our conservation biology folks are putting out on campus to sort of do some monitoring of the bat populations on campus. So that's kind of where we're moving now in terms of open, is getting it out into the Internet of Things. But again, early days for me, but I feel like it's, as an educator, it's beneficial for students to sort of adopt this way of thinking. And I think I will stop there. See if we have any questions. Yeah. Always. What's that? Okay. I already wrote down the one on your LiDAR analysis. Is that what you? Okay, great. Yeah, so especially in GRASS, I'm looking for good tutorials that are helpful for students, for sure. Well, any other questions? But I have a question for you. And again, that employment question. I'm wondering how you all have grappled with that, or your thoughts on when people say that as educators. Yeah.
I very much agree with that. When you learn logical thinking, when you learn the basis behind GIS, I think it's transferable. And as an IT manager, we have crime analysis on the police department. I certainly would be very, very open to that.
Good. That's great. Dave.
Yeah, so, I mean, I've done a little bit of it before sometimes.
Just a bit.
Yeah, so it's working on that. So my outlook is always that when someone comes to me, if we would have a candidate, when I did work at the city, that said they did open source, what that tells you is that they have that initiative about on that. And that kind of speaks to that critical thinking, but they just list out a bunch of coursework on the every products that tells me that they can probably push buttons, but that kind of gets at that problem solving without having to see their work, right? So that's the way we kind of looked at it when I worked at the city, is that we know for sure that, hey, they can go out and find a tutorial, figure out how to do something, and they don't need to necessarily ask me. That's how they're going to probably approach everything, right? So that's why it's probably transferable from somebody that's using QGIS to go into an every product line and figure it out.
Right. This semester, I actually, in one of my courses, I had students do the same exact project in both, just to sort of see. Okay, the buttons are in different places, toolbars are separate, toolbox is different, but I can figure out how to make the maps, analyze the data, if you know enough of the baseline terminology, for sure. Yes.
I work for a state, and we switched to open source recently, and they have a position coming up, and they're looking for someone with experience in Postgres. And also, I would recommend having your students exposed to Postgres and Postgres, because that's comparable to Azure Private.
Right. Absolutely. We have, again, in my intro course, I don't get that far, but when I have had student crews in the past. I mentioned that we had all students work on campus. So I've had students working 15 hours a week, sort of maintaining our laboratory environment. And those are the students that I have dive in and, hey, let's learn some of this together, because you're going to want to know it. And that some of our best, I think, outcomes, I shouldn't say this as someone who mostly teaches, but our work crews teach a lot to our students. So the ones who are who are really interested in GIS, working for a semester or a year, 15 hours a week, they're the ones that have gone on to do some of our best post-grad success stories. So, yes.
Personal experience. So actually, I learned and I started with on GIS, and that's how I got my past two jobs. And it wasn't too difficult to transfer those skills to our GIS. And I think I agree that it's, that somebody who's used QGIS has the ability to go search through a list of plugins. They can find a package that they need. They know how to search for what they're I feel like as a student, like, I agree that's a transferable skill. And as a professional, as a GIS librarian, I think a lot of our students that don't have resources to get like X-ray licenses, or they're looking to be hired into companies that don't have those resources.
Yeah, I agree. That was part of our initiative is we realized so many of our students go into the nonprofit world as first jobs and they may not have access to any financial resources to use so they can hit the ground running. And you're right. I think one thing I have students do is I make them aware of Stack Exchange and other online resources. And my goal is to get you not to ever raise your hand. You shouldn't have to do that. So, we're in time. I think that's, yeah, thank you.